Hello and welcome back to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United. I'm Matt Ketchell, the North East football app and engagement editor here at Chronicle Live, and I'm joined by Paul Joannou, Newcastle's official club historian. This episode is episode 2 of our new history series. Episode by episode, we're walking through the history of Newcastle United. Last week, episode 1 saw us cover Stanley FC, a club formed in Byker that changed their name to Newcastle East End, and a decade or so after their formation in 1881, they controversially move across the city to a patch of land known as St James's Park and change their name to United. That transitional period, 1892-93, is what we're covering in this episode. And to help us do that, myself and Paul Joannou have been joined by another Paul Brown, who brings an extra element of historical expertise to the show, particularly when it comes to the spectator experience during the Victorian era. Paul Brown, welcome to the show. Before we begin, are you able to give us a bit of a background on yourself and some of your work around football history and that of Newcastle too?
Yeah, hiya Matt, hiya Paul. So I'm a football writer and lifelong Newcastle United fan. I've been going since the mid-80s. I was lucky enough to be going home and away during the Keegan era, the Robson era, which seemed like history now to us. I wrote for the fanzines at the time. Now I write for the main football magazines, 442, When Saturday Comes, The Blizzard. And I've written some football history books, the most relevant of which is All With Smiling Faces, which is about what it was like to support Newcastle during the early years from 1881. And I've also written a book called Savage Enthusiasm, which is a complete history of football fans in general, although it has quite a lot of NUFC content in there as well. And most recently, I wrote a book, the Ruhleben Football Association, which is the true story of famous footballers in a World War I prison camp. And again, that has a Newcastle United link because one of the footballers was Edwin Dutton, who was a Newcastle player. And there's more about all of that on my website, which is stuffbypaulbrown.com. And I'm also on Twitter at PaulBrownUK.
Excellent. Yes, definitely give Paul a follow and check his website out if you're interested in Newcastle United and football history. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably are, so definitely do that. It's great to have you with us, Paul. So let's get into it. Paul Joannou, I'll start with you. When exactly did Newcastle East End move away from the east end of the city and arrive at St James's Park?
Well, they spent the first 10 years of their existence in the East End, starting in 1881 onwards. And in the summer of 1892, it was the time for a move again. And it was all because of the problems that Newcastle West End had, their great rivals. They took over the West End club, more or less, who folded because of financial issues.
And was this a surprise move? Did it come out of the blue, or was this something that you think might have been on the cards at the time?
I think it was, I suppose it was a bit of both, really. Newcastle West End had struggled for the last couple of years financially. They couldn't support paying wages of some expensive players that they brought down from Scotland. The gates weren't big enough, so they were struggling. So there was no shock that they folded in the summer of 1892, but it was a bit of a surprise that Newcastle East End moved to St James's Park, which was at the time the enemy's territory. It was very much the city was split football-wise, the East Enders and the West Enders.
And it's an important point that we should stress. This wasn't a merger of the two clubs, Newcastle East End and Newcastle West End. Can you explain exactly what happened?
Yeah, it everybody or lots of people have said it was a merger, and during my early writing days, I suppose I fell into that trap as well, saying it was a merger. It was a merger of sorts. However, without doubt, Newcastle West End folded because of their financial difficulties. They went bankrupt in effect. But the Newcastle West End officials approached Newcastle East End directors. There was a famous meeting in May 1892 at one of East End's directors' houses in Rothbury Terrace, just along from Chillingham Road. And they offered the East Enders the assets that remained with the West End club, including the lease of St James's Park and one or two other things like a few players and the services of the West End directors. So a couple of meetings took place, and East End decided to take up the offer and, in effect, move to St James's Park, and took on board a lot of the West End assets.
Interesting. Rothbury Terrace in Heaton, I know it well. I like it when you throw that detail in, Paul. So that's very interesting that a significant meeting happened there. St James's Park, then, it was emerging as a bit of a prime location for football as the 19th century approached its conclusion.
Yeah, the two clubs, East End, were based, as I've said before, at Chillingham Road in Heaton. It was a nice ground, however, it wasn't as advantageous as St James's Park, which was right in the city centre, as we know now. And while St James's Park wasn't the great palace that we've got at the moment, it was still a far better arena than Chillingham Road. So it was a good move in many ways to move across the city and take up residence at St James's Park.
I'd love to hear about the origins of St James's Park. How did it get its name? Do we know what it was before it became this football pitch?
Well, St James's Park was historically, and still is, it's part of the town moor, which, as everybody in Newcastle knows, is a vast expanse of moorland and grassland in the city centre. It was situated where the Scottish Army pounded the town during the Civil War in 1644, and where several hangings took place in the city, the last being in 1844, which wasn't too far from when football started to be played at St James's Park. At the time, it was just grazing moorland, and it was right next door to the elegant Leazes Terrace, one of Granger's masterpieces in the city. That was built in 1834 and now is a listed building, and one of the main reasons why Newcastle couldn't develop St James's Park as they wished, because they couldn't demolish Leazes Terrace.
Of course.
And in terms of the name, St James's Park, I don't think there's any dramatic story behind that. The name just is taken from the streets adjoining the area, which is St James Street and St James's Terrace, I think it is, which was all part of the local area. There was a chapel called St James many years before, and that's probably where the name comes from.
Fair enough. Do we know then when football was first played there, how many spectators might have been there to witness that momentous occasion? People would have had no grasp on the significance of what they were watching.
No, the first recorded game was in October 1880, when Newcastle Rangers, the first tenants of the area, played a practice game. Now, football had been played on the town moor area and no doubt on the Leazes area around where St James's Park is for a few years around that era, probably before 1880. But the first proper club to start playing at St James's Park was Newcastle Rangers. They stayed there for a couple of years, and then Newcastle West End moved in during 1886. In terms of spectators, right at the beginning, there was probably more cows than football fans around the field. But like at Chillingham Road and in Byker with East End, fans started watching football slowly. There was 50 or so to start with, 100, then 1,000, and eventually at St James's Park, when West End were doing well, we had up to 10,000 watching West End games.
Interesting. I used the word spectators in my last question rather than fans. Paul Brown, to bring you in, at this stage, 1892, the word fans probably wasn't in use when it came to football and sport in general. They weren't yet known as fans, but they were fanatics. Can you tell us what these fanatics were like in 1892, what it was like to go to a match?
Yeah, so as you correctly say, they wouldn't have been known as fans. That was like a baseball term from America for baseball fanatics. So they would have been known as spectators or supporters or enthusiasts. but they definitely were fanatics by the 1890s when football was going through a real boom in popularity. Attendances, as Paul just said, were increasing. So in 1892, East End or Newcastle would average around 3,000. So today's equivalent is generally around like League Two level. But football in general, for big FA Cup matches, you could get 30 or 40,000. So football in general was getting to the equivalent of like Premier League levels of crowds. It had definitely moved from a pastime to a passion. And one of the main reasons for that was that workers had been given Saturday afternoons off through legislation. Previously, they would have worked all day on a Saturday. So they would finish work at lunchtime. They would probably go for a couple of drinks, and then they would go to the ground and they would pack into the ground right up to the touch lines and the flat caps. There were no replica kits or scarves in those days. And before the match, they would be singing. Communal singing was really popular, both in and outside of football grounds. The songs they would sing, not specifically football songs, but they would be the popular songs of the day. And one of those was a music hall song, The Bladen Races. So that's how some of those early songs have become football songs. And then during the match itself, it would have been really noisy, a lot of cheering and yelling. They waved newspapers and handkerchiefs. One of the most popular shouts was "Play up." So you would have heard people shouting "Play up East End" or "Play up Newcastle." By all accounts, there was a lot of swearing and abuse and criticism of players. So they didn't get away with that back in those days. And then after the match and away from the match, at workplaces and in pubs, the fans would have been discussing the matches and the team lineups and everything like that, just like we do today. And one report from the Times said that in Newcastle, very little else was spoken about apart from football. So although the club was relatively small compared to what it is now, the fans that it had, they were really sort of fanatical and passionate about the club.
Amazing, yeah. I can picture it. You've took me back there to it. The interesting about the Bladen Races as well can probably claim to be the oldest song that's sung at football if it was being sung all the way back then.
Yeah, it's certainly one of them. I mean, some clubs that are slightly older than Newcastle had football songs as well, but without a doubt, it's one of them, and it's a good tradition. It's one of the few traditions that we'll have carried on, haven't we, since those times.
Yeah, absolutely. Staying with you, Paul Brown, Newcastle fans know that the current St James's Park has a bit of a slope from the Leazes End down to the Gallowgate End, and the Newcastle captain's often encouraged to attack the Gallowgate End in the second half traditionally. Is it true that the slope was even steeper in the Victorian era? What was St James's Park like, if you could describe the scene if we were to stroll up to a game in 1892?
Yeah, so it was... The slope at the time was notorious, and I think away teams and reporters who were covering away teams really made a big show of it. They called it a greasy, muddy slope. But St James's Park itself was a pretty big ground, relatively big, and it's obviously the central location was the main plus that it had, and its proximity to Central Station, because you had away teams and away fans, because fans did travel to away games at that time. You had them coming by train. So if you were heading up to St James's Park in 1892, obviously the city would have looked quite different, although we have retained a lot of the Georgian buildings, thankfully. But as you got to St James's Park, you would have seen some things in the surrounds that are still there today. So there was a pub where the Strawberry Pub is now. There was a pub there. St James's Street that Paul mentioned before, that was there. It's still there today. Leazes Terrace, obviously, and Leazes Park at the north of the ground. But the ground itself would have looked completely different. There was just one stand on the west side of the ground, and then there would have been soil embankments just for fans to stand on, probably with wooden boards. so you didn't get your shoes too muddy. But apart from that, there were really no facilities whatsoever at the ground. So the players would actually get changed in a local pub on Barrack Road. And it cost around 6p to get in. And the crowd would have been mostly made up of working men. But we do know that there were quite a few women who supported the team at the time. We know that because there is a photograph of East End that was taken actually at Heaton, at the Heaton ground, and in the background in the stand or pavilion behind them, you can see that there are a few female supporters all wearing like big hats, like they're going to the races or something, you know.
Fair play. Paul Joannou, I'll come back to you. So Newcastle East End, they've effectively taken over the prime footballing spot in the city. West End have ceased to exist. How did the fans react to this development?
Well, they weren't very happy, to be honest. It took a while for both sets, the East Enders and the West Enders, to accept the position. West End fans had lost their own club. They weren't happy. And East End support were pretty angry that they had to now travel from Byker and Heaton across to the enemy base in the city centre in the West End old base at St James's Park. So it wasn't a very happy position for the first few months, and it took a while for the club to make sure that all of the city became united, if I want to use that expression.
Okay, so brilliantly, Paul Brown, you, I believe, have some interesting clippings from the Chronicle's letters page of the time. We can think of this as the Victorian version of Newcastle United Twitter, with East End and West End fans arguing about the move. We'd love for you to read a couple of those out for us if you have them.
Yeah, so it was the 10th of May 1892 when the Chronicle reported that East End were moving to St James's Park, and they said there is no doubt that with such a central position and with the certainty of a good team and good games, the occupation will be a most successful one. But then the following day, an East End supporter wrote into the newspaper and he said, "I read with astonishment that East End are going to remove from their present field to St James's Park. I, for one, and I know of many others, am strongly against this. I must express my surprise at East End leaving the district from which they have derived so much support." And then on the following day, another East End fan who gave his name as Disgusted East Ender, which might have made like a pretty good Twitter handle. He wrote in to say that he was worried that his club was leaving a place where they had plenty of support, for one where the former rivals West End had what he called failed to find sufficient support to prevent their becoming defunct. And he said, like he issued like a call to arms. He said, "Will the supporters of East End stir themselves up and prevent, if possible, the team being removed from the east to the west?" And then this went on for a few days, and then a few days later, you've got a former West End supporter writing in quite a sad letter. He's obviously resigned to what's happened, and he says, "I was a firm supporter of the unfortunate West End. I have followed their fortunes for many years. I knew the club when it was a healthy, vigorous concern, and I have seen it gradually sink into a hopeless decline. I am heartily glad that its end has come. West End is defunct, East End is alive and kicking. The survival of the fittest is exemplified." And he said he would rather have one well-run, popular club in the centre of the city. And he said he finished by saying that he hoped that East End would change its name to something more inclusive, and he suggested Newcastle City Football Club, which wasn't quite what they went for, but they did share that sentiment. And then they must have been inundated with messages from fans, because underneath that letter, the Chronicle editor had written, "We've received many other letters upon the same subject, but we must now close this correspondence."
Amazing. Hashtag RIP Newcastle West End. It's amazing to read those correspondence. Paul Joannou, I'll come back to you then. With Newcastle East End having an unhappy fan base, what did they do?
Well, the East End directors initially made pleas in the press for support. because the crowds weren't very good to start with when they moved to St James's Park. They made plays for everybody to come and rally around the camp and support the club. But eventually they decided that they had to do something quite dramatic, and they decided to change the title of Newcastle East End in an attempt to harness both the East Enders and the West Enders. And that was the next step in the development of the club.
And obviously, this is the moment when Newcastle became Newcastle United. Do we know what other names were thrown into the hat, what Newcastle United could have been known as?
Yeah, certainly it's pretty well recorded. There was probably three titles that were put up at the meeting, which we'll chat about in a moment. Newcastle FC, Newcastle City, as Paul mentioned, and the third one was Newcastle United. And at the meeting that took place, it was quoted that it was almost unanimously voted for Newcastle United, which of course is a very appropriate title for what happened before.
Yes, I think they made the right choice with that one, unanimously deciding on United. Paul Brown, in your book, All the Smiling Faces, which tells the story of how Newcastle became Newcastle United, you write that Newcastle are actually the second United in the history of football. Great quiz question. Who were the first?
Do you want me to give the answer, or do you?
Yeah, I think we'll have the answer, and everyone who's listening can bank it and impress people who haven't listened to the podcast.
Yeah, so that was Sheffield United. So yeah. Sheffield, obviously a big sort of hotbed of football. I think what the oldest football club is Sheffield FC, but so Sheffield United were the first United.
Yeah, can I interject there and
yes,
say, yes, it's likely Sheffield United, although with lots of research happening on football at the moment, I think we should be saying it's likely rather than it is. And one of the most recent bits of research on football has noted that Sheffield Football Club isn't the oldest football club in the world. It is the oldest surviving club, formed in 1857. But without doubt, there is a new book, or not new, it's been out for 12 months or 2 years now. The club was in existence in 1824 in Edinburgh, called simply the Football Club. And there are several contenders to being the oldest football club. And certainly from my point of view, having read that book on the Edinburgh Club, that Edinburgh organisation is the oldest, although Sheffield is the oldest surviving club. And despite what you read and see on the web and in FIFA's and the FA's literature, Sheffield FC is not the oldest club in the world.
Okay, we'll play it safe then and say it's likely they were the first United. And hope maybe Newcastle could make a claim to being second. But Paul Brown, you made an interesting point in your book that we tend to ignore the first 11 years of Newcastle history, 1881 to 1892, when the club was known as Stanley and then East End. Meanwhile, other big clubs like Man United and Arsenal, they embraced their early histories under different names, obviously Woolwich, Arsenal, Newton, Heath. Why is it so important that we remember the first 11 years of Stanley and Newcastle East End?
I think it's strange not to, really. Most big clubs have changed their names during the early part of their history. And I think that for Newcastle, the history of the club is one of the things that makes it so great. And those first 11 years, they're the years when the club that we support today was built up. It built its fan base. It had some very good players. It won some silverware. We definitely don't want to be chucking that away. And the club, in those 11 years, it got to matter to people. And I think that's really important. Why would we not sort of celebrate those early years and say that Newcastle United was formed in 1881, and that would mean that this year in November 2021 we should be celebrating the club's 140th anniversary, and I hope. Well, I'll do that anyway. I hope other fans will join in.
Yes, well, we're doing that now by recording this episodic of the history to celebrate that 140th year. So, yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's good that we point this out to listeners. One thing we definitely know is that Newton Heath became Manchester United in 1902. So Newcastle were a full 10 years ahead of Man United in their United. So I just wanted to point that out for some of the pundits out there, Jermaine Genius among others, that Newcastle have 10 years on Man United with that. This episode, of course, covers a hugely pivotal moment in the history of the club. What can you tell us about the specific meeting where they came to decide on the name change from East End to United? Paul Joannou, I'll direct that to you.
Yes, okay. Well, it was on the 9th of December, 1892, that a meeting was convened. It was a Friday evening at the Bath Lane Hall, which is just over Barrack Road on the other side from St James's Park. And a gathering of enthusiasts and club directors debated what should happen and what name they would choose. So, as we mentioned before, they decided on Newcastle United as a title. So Newcastle East End became Newcastle United, who are, as we've kept saying, the very same club as Stanley FC of Byker. And that change worked, but support arrived only very slowly. And it took time to embrace, or that the city embraced the one city club culture.
Do we know who Newcastle played in their first ever game as United, and did they win?
Yes, we certainly know that. In fact, there was 2 games really in typical Newcastle style. The day after the meeting, on the 10th of December, they played Middlesbrough Ionopolis at St James's Park in the Northern League. They lost that game 2-1 in front of around 2,500, and it was played in a snowstorm. And that was before the Football Association actually approved the change in title. So really the official first game, if you want to term it that way, was not until the 24th of December when the FA agreed to change from Newcastle East End to Newcastle United. And by coincidence, the club played Middlesbrough again, but the other Middlesbrough club this time, in a friendly, and they won 2-1 at St James's Park. And that was, in effect, the first official game under the new title of Newcastle United.
Very good. It's also worth noting at this point that the club were keen to join the new Football League, but it hadn't quite happened yet. When did that occur?
It was, they actually tried to join the league straight away in May 1892, the same summer. But they failed. They didn't get enough votes for the election. And it wasn't until the next summer, the close season of 1893, that they tried again, and they were elected into the Football League in the second division in a momentous day, really, because not only were Newcastle United elected, but also Liverpool and Arsenal. All 3 clubs joined at the same time.
And is this the point where some listeners might not be aware, but they actually played in red shirts and there was a change to black and white around this time? Is that correct?
Well, yeah, black and white stripes did not arrive for a little while. Newcastle East End, Stanley and Newcastle East End started off playing in blue shirts. They had dark blue shirts and Cambridge blue shirts. Then they changed to red. And certainly by the time they moved to St James's Park, they were still playing in red shirts. But they had a problem as soon as they joined the Football League. Several of the clubs in the second division all played in red. So there was often colour clashes, and Newcastle eventually decided to change colours during the latter part of 1894.
Wow, so it could have looked very different supporting Newcastle United prior to that change. Do we know why black and white was selected?
Well, the club minutes, which I've been right through, the decision happened in August 1894. There's a minute which decides to change black and white stripes. They don't actually tell us why. However, there's several tales which have come down through history, and it's very difficult to establish the correct or the definitive version. There was a few magpies in the old stand, some people said, and that's why they chose black and white. There were supporters from the old Blackfriars Monastery who were supporters of the club, and they wore black and white habits all the time. So again, a link there. The historic Duke of Newcastle's historic black and white colours were evident as well, and are still evident in the city. Northumberland's black and white tartan has been there for years and years historically. My own particular view, it's likely that they selected the colours because Northumberland had played in black and white stripes, and they perhaps quite simply just adopted the colours of the Northumberland county. And Newcastle East End had already worn black and white stripes occasionally as a change kit, along with various other colours. Indeed, the very first match in the Football League, when they travelled to Arsenal, because Arsenal played in red shirts, Newcastle East End had to change, and they played in blue and white striped shirts. And that fact's only really recently been uncovered when we found a very detailed match report from the Kent Independent, I think it is, newspaper, and it confirms that they played in blue and white.
Wow, interesting. Paul Brown, any other theories on the change to black and white, and maybe when the Magpies nickname might have come into play?
Yeah, well, on the black and white, I mean, I'm 100% agree with Paul. I think it was just that black and white stripes were the Northumberland county colours, and that those strips, we've got to remember that a set of football strips would have been pretty expensive. So I think that they possibly wore the exact same kits that Northumberland County used. They were probably, Northumberland County team played at St James's Park, so it's a possibility that those kits, were stored at St James's Park and they were there, and so Newcastle just used them. And kind of symbolically also, it's kind of making a statement that Newcastle are kind of representing Northumberland. They're the team of Northumberland, which I suppose they did go on to become. As for the nickname, again, nothing really fanciful about it. Early reports after they'd switched to black and white stripes referred to them as playing in magpie colours. And so I think it just came from that. It just simply came from the black and white colours, and they became known as the Magpies.
Romantic to imagine there was some magpies nesting in one of the stands near the ground, though. I do like that theory. Finally, I've got a question for you both. Can we talk a bit about some of the players of note during this first season or two as Newcastle United? Paul Brown, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I would pick a couple of Willies. Willie Thompson, who was the local centre forward, he was from just outside Ashington. So he was, although they didn't wear numbers on the back of the kits at that time, so you can't say he was a number 9, but he was the first in a long line of local centre forwards, and he scored, I think, 65 goals for the club. And the other Willie was Willie Graham, who was described as a thick-set Scottish centre half, which at the time was a central midfielder, and he was the club captain, and he made over 100 appearances for the club. And there's a little anecdote involving the two of them. After the first league game, Newcastle's first league game against Arsenal, which they drew 2-2, a reporter went into the dressing room and he found Willie Graham, the captain, absolutely fuming, and he was upset because they'd had a terrible journey down, overnight train journey, but mainly Arsenal had scored using a handball that the referee hadn't spotted or hadn't given. And Willie Graham was absolutely furious, and he said to the reporter, he said, "I'm telling you now, we play Arsenal in the return game in a couple of weeks at St James's Park, and I'm telling you now, we're going to beat them by at least 4 goals. And then fast forward 3 or 4 weeks, Arsenal come up to St James's Park and Newcastle hammer them 6-0. And Willie Thompson, the Ashington centre forward, he scored a hat-trick. So they did get revenge for that handball.
Brilliant, fair play to the lads. And Paul Joannou, any other players that we should nod to at this stage?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth pointing out that apart from Willie Graham, who was from a famous Scottish family at the time, footballing family, there were several other Scottish footballers. Newcastle East End brought down quite a lot of Scots at that time, and for many, many years to follow. But in that team, in the very early days of 1892, 93, there were people like James Collins, Joe Wallace, two great Scottish forwards, Tom Crate, another Scottish forward, and Jock Sawley, and also Bob Creeley, who was a fearsome-looking halfback who also came from north of the border. And another player who was a local lad who played alongside Willie Thompson in the Ashington-Bedlington area was Harry Ray, who was very talented, and eventually he made a big move to Everton, who were much more advanced than Newcastle East End at that time.
Interesting. Our first heroes. Great to hear those names in the descriptions. So there, we'll leave it there. We've covered 1892-93. Newcastle East End have taken over at St James's Park following the demise of West End. A bit of further reading, we should definitely point out Paul Brown's book Savage Enthusiasm, which covers the Victorian era of football, but from a football spectator's point of view, and Paul's book All the Smiling Faces, which I have here, which is the story of how Newcastle became United, covering the team from 1881, as we now know is when the history began, to 1910. Both fantastic books. I've read both of them. Really great. Must reads if you're interested in Newcastle United history, particularly the club's hugely important formative years. So that's episode 2 covered. The first official takeover at St James's Park has happened. I said I wouldn't mention that dreaded word, but that's effectively what's happened here. In 1892, Newcastle East End have taken over at St James's Park following the demise of Newcastle West End. Please join us next week. We're going to jump forward to 1897-98 when Newcastle are promoted to the top division. In the meantime, thank you Paul Joannou and Paul Brown. Listeners, thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Everything is Black and White podcast via whichever podcast platform you use. Follow Chronicle Live's Newcastle United channels on social media. We're at Chronicled NUFC on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And keep an eye out for new episodes of Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, every week. If you have a question about the history of Newcastle United, email those to us. Our email address is the eibwpodcast@reachplc.com. I'll read out the best on future shows and we'll attempt to answer them. Thanks so much for listening to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United.